Farmer evicted due to developers wanting his land. The next day, an Apache helicopter lands in his field. The roar of the helicopter blades sliced through the dawn air as Frank Hargrove stood in the middle of his landing zone, waving the familiar light patterns that had guided military pilots to safe landings for 5 decades. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision. But tonight, the ritual felt different. The eviction notice burning a hole in his pocket made each movement feel like a final farewell. As the Black Hawk touched down, Frank fought back tears. How could he tell these young pilots that after tonight, Hargrove Farm would no longer be their sanctuary? If you're enjoying this story of loyalty and unexpected friendship, make sure to hit that like button right now. And subscribe to the Heartwarming Stories Spark channel for more tales that celebrate American values and the unsung heroes among us. Frank Hargrove had just turned 73 when the fancy letterhead envelope arrived from Next Gen Development. The gray-haired farmer sat at his kitchen table, calloused fingers tracing the embossed logo as his wife Eleanor placed a steaming mug of coffee beside him. "Another offer?" she asked, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd been fighting the same battle for months. Frank nodded, unfolding the letter with trembling hands. "Final notice," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. 30 days. Eleanor's hand found his shoulder, squeezing gently. The kitchen around them hadn't changed much since 1972. Faded yellow wallpaper, a radio that still picked up AM stations, and framed photographs chronicling 5 decades of military helicopters landing in their south field. What had started with Frank's father during the Korean War had become a family tradition spanning generations. "We still have options," Eleanor said, though they both knew that wasn't true. One by one, their neighbors had capitulated to Next Gen's offers. The Thorntons' place where helicopter crews used to rest between exercises, the Miller property that served as an emergency landing zone for decades. Now, Hargrove Farm stood alone, an island of resistance in a sea of surrendered land. Frank pushed away from the table and walked to the window. Beyond the farmhouse, past the weathered red barn, lay the south field with its carefully maintained landing markers. Even from here, he could make out the worn path where he'd walked thousands of nights, setting lights to guide young pilots home safely. "Dad would roll over in his grave," Frank muttered. 50 years of service to our country. And what does it matter to these tech people? Just prime real estate for their campus. Eleanor came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Remember what Commander Reynolds said when he retired last year? Hargrove Farm trained more combat pilots than the entire eastern seaboard. That means something, Frank." His throat tightened. "Not to Next Gen, it doesn't." After dinner, Frank made his nightly trek to the landing zone. The rural Wisconsin stars spread overhead in a familiar tapestry as crickets sang their summer melody. He checked his watch. The night training flight from Fort McCoy would arrive in 20 minutes. He began setting out the landing lights with mechanical precision, each one placed exactly where his father had taught him decades ago. "Perfect approach, Vector," his dad used to say in his gruff voice. "These boys need consistent patterns when they're learning night landings." As Frank worked, memories flooded back. Desert Storm pilots practicing emergency procedures in his field before deployment. Young recruits from the late 70s nervously executing their first solo landings. Seasoned veterans from Afghanistan showing rookies the ropes. For half a century, Hargrove Farm hadn't just been land. It had been a classroom, a training ground, a crucial link in America's military readiness. The next morning, after another sleepless night, Frank drove to town and bought supplies. By noon, he had hammered a large sign into the ground near his property entrance. His hands shook as he painted the words. "Notice, Military Helicopter Training Zone closing Hargrove Farm, serving our armed forces since 1952" beneath it. In smaller letters, he added, "Thank you for 50 years of shared service to our country." The sign felt like surrender, but Frank needed people to understand what was being lost. He didn't notify the military liaisons about the impending closure. He couldn't bring himself to make those calls yet. Instead, he continued his nightly ritual, setting out landing lights, radioing coordinates, watching the helicopters come and go with increasing heaviness in his heart. "You seem quiet tonight, Mr. Hargrove," Captain Walsh commented 3 evenings later as his crew refueled. Frank nodded toward the farmhouse where Eleanor was approaching with her signature thermos and sandwich basket. Just getting old, I suppose. The captain's eyes narrowed. Saw your sign out front. Is it true? 30 days, Frank confirmed, his voice rough. Developers bought everything around us. Zoning changed. Board meeting next week to finalize the permits. But this is... Captain Walsh gestured to the landing zone. This is historic. We've been training here since Korea. History doesn't pay property taxes, Frank replied bitterly. And NextGen needs this spot for their engineering building. Eleanor arrived with coffee and sandwiches, her smile forced but warm. Roast beef tonight, boys, and those cookies you liked last time, Captain. As the crew ate, a car pulled up near the landing zone. A young woman with a press badge and camera stepped out. Sandra Chen, Midwest Military Times, she introduced herself. Mind if I ask about your sign, Mr. Hargrove? Frank hesitated, but Eleanor nodded encouragingly. What's to tell? We're being forced out. Would you mind sharing the farm's history? What it's meant to military aviation training? For the next hour, as the summer sun set behind his cornfields, Frank told the reporter about his father creating the landing zone during the Korean War, about the thousands of pilots who trained there, about the letters they'd received from servicemen and women who credited their survival in combat to the night landing skills they'd mastered at Hargrove Farm. Dad always said it was the least we could do, Frank explained, gesturing toward a faded photograph of his father standing beside a Huey helicopter. He couldn't serve himself. Bad heart. But he could help those who did. Sandra's article appeared online 3 days later. The headline read, 5 decades of military training ground to be bulldozed for tech campus. The piece included photos of Frank's sign, of helicopters landing in his field, and of Frank himself standing where his father had stood for so many years. This story isn't just about land or tradition. It's about the bonds between civilians and the military that have sustained our nation through decades of challenges. If you're moved by Frank's dedication, take a moment to reflect on the unsung heroes in your own community and share this video with someone who appreciates American values. Frank didn't expect much from the article, just another story about progress erasing history. But something about that sign, about 50 years of quiet service suddenly ending, touched people's hearts. The story began circulating through military channels, shared by current and former pilots who had trained at Hargrove Farm. Remember those night landings at the Wisconsin farm? That old guy with the lights and his wife with the coffee? They're losing everything. Frank was in his barn that Friday evening, organizing tools he'd soon have to sell, when the landline rang. Eleanor had been trying to get him to switch to a cell phone for years, but he'd always insisted the old phone worked just fine. Hargrove residence, he answered. Mr. Hargrove, please hold for General Richardson. Frank's hand tightened on the receiver. For a moment he thought it must be a prank, but seconds later, a different voice came on the line. Mr. Hargrove, this is General Michael Richardson, chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I saw the article about your farm. Would you tell me about it? For the next 20 minutes, Frank talked with the general, not about politics or property values, just about service, about late nights guiding helicopters in, about watching young pilots become skilled aviators, about teaching the next generation what dedication to country really means. Mr. Hargrove, the general said finally, we can't lose training grounds like yours. Give me 24 hours. Frank could hardly hold the phone. His hands were shaking so badly. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs had just promised to help save his farm after months of thinking all was lost. Eleanor, he called out to his wife. Eleanor, you won't believe what just happened. She came running from the kitchen. Frank, what is it? That was General Richardson on the phone. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs? He saw our story. He wants to help save the farm. Eleanor started crying right there in the kitchen. After all the sleepless nights, after watching Frank work himself to exhaustion maintaining those fields, finally someone understood. The next morning, Frank had just finished his chores when the unmistakable thump, thump, thump of rotor blades filled the air. An Apache helicopter appeared over the tree line, followed by 3 Blackhawks. As they landed in his training field, Frank saw the markings. These weren't regular training crews. These were the Pentagon's own fleet. 2 uniformed officials stepped out carrying briefcases. Frank's heart started racing. This had to be about the general's call. Mr. Hargrove, one of them said, showing her credentials. Colonel Diana Vasquez, Pentagon Special Projects. We're here to make sure your farm stays exactly where it belongs, serving the United States military. For the next hour, they sat at Frank's kitchen table, Eleanor serving coffee while they went through paperwork. Colonel Vasquez explained how the farm would be designated as a protected military training facility, making it impossible for developers to touch it. The military would lease the landing zones, providing the Hargroves with steady income while preserving the crucial training area. "Sign here, sir," she said, pointing to the bottom of the document. "This ensures your farm will continue serving our forces for generations to come." Frank's hands were shaking as he signed. After months of thinking he'd lose everything, it felt like a dream. Colonel Vasquez smiled as she packed up the papers. "General Richardson wanted us to tell you something," she said, standing to leave. "He said to remind you that some things are worth more than money, and supporting our military is one of them." That same day, the officials paid a visit to NextGen's offices. The developers' faces turned pale when the military officers walked in. No more fancy talk about property values now. They handed them new paperwork, official orders about protected military installations. "But our development plans," one executive started to say, "have been superseded." Colonel Vasquez cut him off. By national security interests. The developers suddenly found a way to revise their campus design, not just around Hargrove Farm, but around all the surrounding farmland that supported military training. Within hours, other farmers started getting calls. The Thornton place would stay a rest area. The Millers could keep their emergency landing zone. One by one, the threatened farms were being protected. True to his word, within 24 hours, everything had changed. Today, Hargrove Farm still stands. Frank still maintains the landing zones, though now his grandson Tyler works alongside him, learning the family tradition. The training schedules are busier than ever, and Eleanor makes sure every crew has hot coffee and fresh sandwiches, just like always. Frank still stays up for night training, saying the same thing he said for 40 years. "Can't expect our boys to learn in daylight only." That final eviction notice hangs in his barn now. Sometimes people ask Frank about the day the general called, but he just smiles and changes the subject. He'd rather show them the new landing lights, or let them watch the helicopters practice approaches. What happened at Hargrove Farm wasn't just about saving one family's land. It was about recognizing that loyalty still means something in America. It showed that while some see only dollar signs, others understand the true value of tradition and service. In a world that often seems to prioritize profit over everything else, Frank's story reminds us that the connections between ordinary citizens and those who serve can create extraordinary bonds that transcend generations. When Frank's father first offered their land for helicopter training in 1952, he couldn't have known that his simple act of patriotism would create a legacy spanning decades. He couldn't have foreseen how many lives would be touched, or potentially saved, because pilots had a safe place to master crucial skills. But he understood something fundamental: that a nation's strength isn't measured solely by its military might, but by the countless invisible threads that connect civilians to service members. These connections aren't always dramatic or headline-worthy. They're found in small towns across America where local businesses offer military discounts, in teachers who take extra time with children of deployed parents, in neighbors who mow lawns for military families during deployments. Like Frank's nightly ritual of setting landing lights, these acts of support often go unnoticed by the wider world until they're threatened. Perhaps the most powerful lesson from Frank's experience is that true service doesn't seek recognition. For 50 years, the Hargrove family quietly performed their duty without fanfare or acknowledgement. They didn't maintain their landing zone for praise or profit. They did it because they believed in supporting those who serve our country. It was only when this tradition faced extinction that others recognized its true value. In our rapidly changing world, where progress often seems to demand the sacrifice of tradition, Frank's story challenges us to ask deeper questions about what we're willing to lose. It invites us to consider whether efficiency and development should always take precedence over heritage and service. It reminds us that once certain traditions are lost, they cannot easily be replaced. Like the institutional knowledge passed down when Frank teaches Tyler exactly how to position landing lights, just as his father taught him half a century ago. The farm's salvation also demonstrates that when ordinary people stand firm in their convictions, their stories can reach those with the power to help. Frank didn't organize protests or launch social media campaigns. He simply placed a sign expressing gratitude for 50 years of shared service. That honest expression of loss resonated across the country, eventually reaching someone who understood what was at stake. Each night, as helicopters continue to land safely at Hargrove Farm, they carry forward a tradition that almost disappeared. Each young pilot who masters night landings in that field becomes part of a lineage stretching back to the Korean War. And each time Eleanor hands out coffee and sandwiches, she affirms that supporting our military isn't just about grand gestures, it's about consistent, reliable presence through changing times. In the end, Frank's farm wasn't saved because it was profitable or efficient. It was saved because someone recognized that its value couldn't be measured in acres or dollars. It was measured in the thousands of pilots who trained there, in the skills they carried into service, and in the simple, profound truth that some traditions are worth fighting to preserve. Was this story meaningful to you? Share your thoughts about loyalty and service in the comments below. Do you know of similar stories in your community where traditions have been preserved against the odds? We'd love to hear them. And don't forget to subscribe to the Heartwarming Stories Spark channel for more stories that celebrate American values, resilience, and the remarkable connections between ordinary citizens and those who serve.